All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. My name is David Desnick. I'm the Director of Research here. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you, both familiar faces in the audience and new ones. I hope this really shows quite a broad audience, the kind of work we're doing here and how proud we are to bring really some superb experts here to talk about North Korea today. So just a couple of housekeeping items. Today's event is being live streamed, video recorded, and broadcast on C-SPAN. So it's as on the record as it could possibly be, which means we would like you to turn off your phones so we don't have any interruptions. Otherwise, your frozen ringtone will be caught for posterity and never forgotten. To set an example, I will go ahead and turn off my phone right here. So with that, I'd like to turn to the issue at hand and just say a word about, why this is so important, obviously for the world, but also in particular for FDD. North Korea on its own is something, an immense threat to the United States, but we've done extensive work here on Iran and on other challenges in the Middle East, and it's deeply relevant there as well. We know there's a deep relationship between Pyongyang and Tehran on developing ballistic missiles. The UN has recently reported that Pyongyang continues to provide chemical weapons-related material to Bashar al-Assad and his regime, which of course then uses them in attacks on civilians. And of course, it was more than a decade ago that Israeli airstrikes destroyed a nuclear reactor built in Syria by the North Korean regime. So this is very much a global threat and not just a regional one. And of course, more urgent than ever now that we are looking forward to a summit back on June 12th in Singapore. And with that in mind, I'd like to say a little bit about each of the experts we have on the stage, the dais with us today. A lot of people like to talk about North Korea and give advice, but there's probably a more select few who truly have deep expertise, the kind that is the kind of advice worth giving to presidents, secretaries of states, and other world leaders. So it's really great that we have that level of advice here. If you listen to what the people on stage are going to say, follow them on Twitter, see them on CBS and on other networks where they've recently appeared, I think you'll be learning a tremendous amount. So I will go actually in alphabetical order. Just first, our moderator will be Barbara Demick. She is now the New York correspondent for the Los Angeles Times and has been a bureau chief in Beijing and Seoul. She's the author of 2 books, including Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea, and that was a finalist for the National Book Award. Next, Bruce Klingner, who has served in very senior positions in the intelligence community. Of course, I've followed his work for many years in his role as a senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. Next is Dr. Jung Pak, who I've had the pleasure of meeting more recently, and again has had experience at the absolute highest levels of the intelligence community and is already producing a very valuable work in her capacity at Brookings, where she is a senior fellow, and the SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies. And finally, Anthony Ruggiero. It's been a tremendous pleasure to be working with Anthony the past year. I have learned a tremendous amount about North Korea. I would recommend to all of you his work, which obviously you can find on our website. If you just follow him day in and day out, whether it's op-eds, longer papers, or Twitter, he's almost a one-man machine for educating people about the kind of policy we should have on sanctions. And with that, I also would like to direct all of your attention to the new FDD research product, Maximum Pressure 2.0, How to Improve Sanctions on North Korea, that has just come out today, that Anthony is the author of. Tremendous wealth of information in there. And so with that, I'd like to thank you again for coming, for sharing your afternoon with us, and turn it over to Barbara to moderate the panel.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, I'm delighted to be in the role of the moderator because I don't think I need to state my opinions. I can only do what journalists are happy doing, which is asking questions. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 down the line, asking you quickly, what do you think of this upcoming summit? Jung Pak, you got the short straw. You go first.
What do I think about the upcoming? So somebody was saying to me the other day, so I can't believe what a whirlwind of activity the past 6 months have been. And I said to them, think about the past 7 years, because I was at the agency when Kim Jong Un came to power, and ever since then it's been, as you know, Anthony, who was at Treasury at the time, that it was a steady pace of missile tests every 2 weeks, cyber attacks, and all sorts of things. So it's hard to, and we could have never imagined that at 7 years later, we would be at this point where the U.S. president has agreed to meet with Kim Jong Un, despite all of the provocative activities and their advancement of their nuclear weapons capabilities. So I think, the summit, I think, it sounds as if both sides, both the President Trump and Kim Jong Un want this to happen, and they're both deeply invested in this. And I think North Korea is going to try to make sure that things go well, in that the president doesn't leave the room in the way that he has threatened that he might in various forms. So, but I think it remains to be seen exactly what's going to come out of that summit, and I know there's a lot of hand-wringing and concern about how we're going to be better off or worse off after this meeting.
I was afraid you were going to ask me what's going to happen at the summit, and I would have had to give you what we used to call the CIA salute. We just don't know. I mean, at this point, we really just can't make any predictions. We're just holding on for the ride. A lot of times, Korea watchers will describe following North Korea, particularly the last, I'd say, 2 years, as a roller coaster ride with ups and downs and twisty turns. I think it's more like the carnival ride, the Scrambler, where things are going in all different directions at once, because at least a roller coaster is linear. This has been twisting and turning all at the same time. So, it's kind of gotten to the point where, if you step away from your Google feed or your Twitter feed for 10 minutes, or like yesterday, I took a nap and woke up to find out, all these emails about what do I think about Assad meeting with Kim, you really just sort of can't, lose focus for an hour or you're hopelessly behind. I think the summit is hastily thrown together. Yes, the way previous negotiations have gone, have all failed, but I don't think that means you totally throw out the diplomatic playbook and just kind of do a fly by the seat of your pants diplomacy. I think what was lost in last month's 4 North Korea grumpy grams was the focus people had was on the threats and the insults, which are pretty standard for North Korean diatribes. But I think the most important one was the first missive from Kim Dae-gwan, where what he did basically was very publicly and very clearly articulate what North Korea's position was on denuclearization, which is a wide chasm separate from what the U.S. Desire is, as well as what I think the White House thought North Korea had agreed to. So I think there was a scramble in the White House. I think they were surprised that this was not going to be as easy as a summit as they perhaps perceived, because as they sort of described it incredulously, he agreed to talk about denuclearization, and now they're saying they're not embracing CVID and unilateral disarmament. Sort of like, yeah, that's anyone who's followed North Korea for any length of time knows the heavy conditionality that they require for any constraints on their nuclear program. And also simply the fact that they define denuclearization as global arms control rather than unilateral disarmament, and as a self-professed member of the nuclear club, they'll go to zero once everyone else goes to zero. So I think what we saw on Friday by President Trump after his meeting with Kim Yong-chol was sort of a lowering of expectations. I thought it looked like a watering down of a number of previous U.S. policy positions.
Well, I mean, I guess I'll start there. I mean, we don't know where we are on North Korea policy. I mean, I would say, on Thursday, just the day before, the president was speaking from the driveway of the White House. Secretary Pompeo was crystal clear, I thought, in a response to a question that said, Kim Jong Un had not made this strategic decision to denuclearize, and was clear that he had to decide whether he wanted to move his country on a different path. Given that, I think it's clear that the substantive positions which Bruce is referencing, I think the focus on the size of the table, who's paying for their hotel, where it's going to be, all those I'm sure are important issues that people will report on, and I certainly have views on it based on the sanctions implications and the max pressure implications, but it really hides the one fact we know of, which is the two sides are very far apart on the only, in my view, the only thing or the first thing that matters in these negotiations, which is, has Kim made a strategic decision to denuclearize? And in my view, if the answer is no, you don't need 3 summits for that. If the answer is yes, then okay, then you can have a discussion over sequencing, which again, there seems to be, if you believe there's some difference within the U.S., there might be some difference within the U.S. government itself, whether it's the Bolton Libya model or what I hope not, a longer phased model. But I think, when people were asking me on Friday, is max pressure dead because, Trump said he's not even going to use the phrase anymore, which made me very sad. But I reminded people, I was like, a week ago, the summit was off. So who knows? I mean, I think it's refreshing to hear, if I can say, it's refreshing to hear Korea experts say, we don't know, here's our best guess. And I think as you're watching things over the next, 8 days through the summit and after the summit, I would recommend following people who are at least honest like that, because people who say they actually do know probably don't know, because none of us really know what's going on. I wish we could say more than that, but I think we have really good best guess. But who knows what Kim is really going to do in that meeting?
I think I like Bruce's comment and Anthony's, yours too, in terms of the president has lowered expectations, but now it seems there are no expectations. We're not going to talk about human rights. North Korea can go at their own pace whenever they want, and whatever you feel comfortable with. So it seems as if we've gone from high expectations to unrealistic expectations of complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement immediately to almost no hard demands on North Korea on these types of issues.
And I would just say, the whole thing, I would just say even that's unclear. The whole, you want to go quick, you want to go slow. It wasn't even clear. Does that mean denuclearization, or does that mean the strategic decision that Pompeo was talking about less than 24 hours earlier, or slightly more than 24 hours earlier? So it wasn't even clear to me that, maybe it was the strategic decision, and that Trump and the folks in the White House believe Trump has to say numerous times, we're not going to attack you, for Kim to feel certain that they're not going to attack them. That wasn't even crystal clear to me. So
I think that's right, and because what the president says today is might be completely different tomorrow or 6 hours from now. But I also think that what is Kim getting out of this? What is he learning from all of this? And if you look at some of the regime propaganda, they're talking about the Trump model, and they're clearly appealing to Trump's personal inclinations or personal preferences. Not the Bolton model, not the Libya model, not any other model, but the Trump model, which is something that it's still kind of amorphous. So I think from what I might think that North Korea is getting out of this whole situation is that there is policy disagreement, or that there is some policy confusion within the White House, or at least that's what I think the North Koreans might perceive of this, and that President Trump ultimately is the one that directs the policy on this issue.
Yeah, my only hope is that North Korea is as confused as those of us in Washington are. I find the Trump administration's policy on North Korea is a lot like the weather in New England, and I grew up in New England. It's sort of, if you don't like it, wait 10 minutes and it's going to change. So whether it's part of a brilliant negotiating tactic or differences or factions, whatever, within the U.S. administration, we're not sure. But I think some of the lessons that North Korea may take away from it is that the U.S. now seems very eager for this summit, that I think we've lost a lot of leverage in that eagerness, that we haven't really gotten anything in return for this agreement. Even when the White House explained why the president had canceled the summit, they didn't say, oh, it's because of the insults or the threats of the North Korean statements. It was broken promises, and they laid out a series of, I thought, very cogent promises that had been broken or perceived to be broken. And then when 24 hours later or less, the president said the summit is most likely back on, there wasn't any movement on resolving those broken promises, or there wasn't any movement on narrowing this gap between what is not only a U.S. proposal of CVID, but the UN requirement of CVID. So it seemed we went back to a summit without really getting anything in return.
Anthony, I wanted to ask you about your new report, which I think was dated today. You seem to feel that maximum pressure was, if we can still use the term, working very well, and that we've moved away from that rather quickly. Do you want to give us a quick synopsis of your report?
Sure. I mean, I sat down and came up with a bunch of recommendations. I whittled 16 down to 6. There were a lot more that I'm sure that people could come up with. I mean, my view, the bottom line of maximum pressure is that I know the president doesn't want to talk about it now, but it's clear that that played a large role in getting them back to the table. And it's, when we talk about playbooks, we haven't said the word playbook, but I'm sure we'll use that phrase a lot. The thing that concerns me now is that the U.S. is playing from a playbook it used in the 2000s and not to our benefit. The fact is that last week they had a set of designations, sanctions ready to roll out, and they chose not to issue those sanctions. Fortunately, that feels very similar to what we did in the 2000s. Not only did we not continue to issue sanctions, we rolled them back in a lot of instances. So the question here for me goes back to, if North Korea has not decided to denuclearize, then really the next step should be maximum pressure 2.0. And the 6 recommendations were sanctioning Chinese banks, which frankly should have already happened, increasing the focus on North Korea's shipping sector, defending South Korea and Japan, referring the Kim regime for its human rights abuses either to the ICC or to a separate tribunal, enforcing U.S. sanctions on North Korea overseas laborers, and stopping North Korea exploitation of diplomatic privileges. But I'll say the issue with maximum pressure is that it's not just following the letter of the sanctions, it's going beyond as essentially the spirit of the sanctions. And with the president saying what he did on Friday, with other actions, I think we're eroding at the leverage that the president had with North Korea. I mean, we're already seeing a report this morning in the Washington Post about Southeast Asia. We're already seeing reports about China rolling back some of their sanctions. I would say the framework still exists. I would not say that we have to go back to zero, to the 0 day on maximum pressure, but every day that we allow it to erode, it's going to be harder and harder to bring us back to that point. Oh, and the one thing I would say too is on Iran. I mean, the things are the issues are interlinked now, because you have an administration that got out of the Iran nuclear deal promising essentially their own version of maximum pressure on Iran. And so what they're going, unlike with North Korea, where we had many UN resolutions that served as the backbone for that, on Iran, it's going to be mostly persuasion and going above and implementing U.S. sanctions as opposed to UN sanctions. And any effort to really chip away at the North Korea maximum pressure policy could cause countries to question, why should we implement and harm our own economic relationship with Iran or other countries because of your policy, because it might change in a week. So we have to be careful about both of those factors.
I just wanted to go back to something that Dr. Pak said about this Trump model. That's fascinating to me. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it. And actually, a question for all of you, especially those of you with an intelligence background. I mean, the North Koreans are really seem to be playing this very smartly. And I think actually the most impressive thing I've ever seen North Korea do, beyond the missile test or the satellite, was that big white envelope they sent to Trump. I thought, wow, they have really, you know what I'm talking about, everybody, the white envelope? The letter from Kim Jong Un came in this like game show ready big white envelope, which was just perfect for, the setting and the press conference. I mean, again, an intelligence question, how are they doing this so cleverly? Have they been studying Trump's personality? Do they have the same kind of psychoanalytic researchers that we have in their intelligence community? And is it all Kim Jong Un? Is he that smart, or is somebody telling him what to do?
I think, the North Koreans are a single issue country, and that's us. We have other things that that's going on: the economy, trade, the wars. But for North Korea, Kim Jong Un is lucky to have people around him who have decades of experience just working on the U.S. portfolio. And that white envelope, the size of that envelope, suggested to me that along with the so-called blowing up of the nuclear test site, that suggested to me that they are very well aware of the theater that's involved in in the past several months since the Olympics. The Olympics, of course, it's international global theater. The Inter-Korean Summit was this big, it was the Oscars, it was the Super Bowl, all rolled up into one. And it was televised. And the meeting at the White House with that envelope, it creates more drama and impact than just a smaller size envelope. So I think the North Koreans, if anything, are really good at propaganda. That's what they exist on. That's what they thrive on. That's how they justify their existence to their people and to the outside. And I think for North Korea, they've pretty much have been playing along with the theater of symmetry as much as I'd say the South Koreans and the U.S. have been doing.
Yeah, I would think, I'll give North Korea mixed reviews. Sort of on the one hand, the positive side, just as we have leadership analysts, they certainly should. And I think North Korea struggled like others, to try to understand President Trump because he's very unique and very different from his predecessors. I read finally The Art of the Deal on a long flight back from New Zealand, and if you sort of subtract out the week in the life of a real estate broker in New York, there are a number of precepts there which really I think strike home. And just to cite 6 of them, which it kind of shows at this point it's less important to be a North Korea expert than to be a Trump expert in trying to predict what the U.S. will do. What Trump said is, I make deals. I do it to do it. It's my art form. So, this quest for doing deals, being better than the predecessors. Another one is listen to your gut. I draw my own conclusions. I learn not to be overly impressed by academic credentials. And you think back even during the campaign of, I know more about Afghanistan than 4-star generals. And then I think sort of this, when people are worried that he's not listening to enough North Korea experts or reading a thick briefing book, I think it's just sort of, he goes with the gut, he goes with his instinct. Another one is think big. If you're going to be thinking, you might as well think big. I was out to build something monumental. If you're going to make a deal of any significance, you have to go to the top. And I think that plays in with what we're seeing. Truthful hyperbole. That people want to believe that something is the biggest and the greatest and the most spectacular. So why not let them believe that? So it's, he said, truthful exaggeration or truthful hyperbole. And I think that's one of the things, in a way, we've already seen from the White House, where Pompeo and others will be saying, we're seeing that North Korea is saying things they've never said before. And in fact, they're saying exactly what they've been saying for 27 or more years. And that's one of my worries, is that we come out of this Singapore summit with something that looks remarkably like the 6-party talks or anything that the president has previously criticized, but it is hyped as something that's historic and new and groundbreaking. 2 final ones. Sometimes it pays to be a little wild. That one makes me nervous. But sometimes your best investments are the ones you don't make. And as he said, if it's not a good deal, he's willing to walk away from it. We'll see, because right now it seems that he's pretty eager for a success, and you can define success in many ways. So, I think that's more of a set of indicators than trying to say what U.S. longstanding policy is. On the other hand, I think North Korea has shot itself in the foot a couple times, even recently. There was this irrational exuberance in South Korea after the Inter-Korean Summit. And then they did these 4 very kind of insulting, threatening, ham-fisted kind of missives that they've done in the past. It's like, guys, you blew it. You lost a lot of the goodwill, a lot of the positive perceptions that Kim Jong Un was different. And then just even over the weekend, reports that Assad is going to meet with Kim Jong Un, whereas, okay, of all the dictators in the world, you had to pick the one that the U.S. has recently bombed and that Trump has been very critical of. Again, it's sort of losing the goodwill that they had generated with a lot of these diplomatic initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I mean, I agree with all that. I would just say it seems like North Korea is, putting the hook in the water to see if the U.S. would bite at it, and it seems like at every time we do, right? I mean, I think I was surprised. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, the first Kim Jong-un statement. I thought, I mean, that's been completely papered over. I mean, they were very clear in that CVID is dead to them. Like, that's not something they're interested in. And even the conciliatory statement, which wasn't really conciliatory, right? They didn't call us for 6 days or whatever and let someone sit in Singapore like a senior White House official for 3 days. But even at the end of that, it's depending on which translation you look at, they do, it says at the very end, step by step or phased, right? I mean, that's the clearest thing. I think that the North Koreans, I've always been worried over the last year and a half that the North Koreans and the Chinese think they know this administration, but really don't. So while it seems like the North Koreans have the U.S. on the hook, I'm very worried that we will get another version of the 2005 joint statement. The administration will come out of that meeting and everybody will criticize it, and then that could backfire on the North Koreans. I think that this administration could then move in a much different direction than they are expecting. And so I'm worried about not just the Nobel Prize side of this administration, but then also the sort of lashing out if they're embarrassed side. So I hope the North Koreans, I hope Kim knows what he's doing, because both sides can be dangerous.
Bruce, you did an op-ed recently I think it was for the LA Times, in fact, going over past North Korean statements about their promises to denuclearize. Could you give us a little?
Yeah, I think it was after the Inter-Korean summit, where again, if you've been doomed to work North Korea for any length of time, everything looks familiar, and you tend to remember. Well, you remember things and times that North Korea said something better than you remember your own kids' birthdays. But what I found with the Panmunjom Declaration was, it was really plagiarism. A lot of regurgitated promises from the past that North Korea had repeatedly violated. So, I couldn't go into lengthy details, but behind the scenes, I was looking like, okay, this paragraph is from 1972, this paragraph is from 1992, this paragraph is from 2000. So it really was a lot of previous promises. And similar to the previous Inter-Korean declarations, there was this, even the order of it, I thought was wrong, is that, you had, these are the wonderful things that South Korea will provide to the North. These are the security actions that both sides or the South will do to make North Korea feel more secure. And, oh, by the way, since we are about to sign off on this 2.5-page document, denuclearization, we both pledge to do what we have to do. And it's like, I would have liked denuclearization to be at the beginning, because that's what everything else flows from, is if you can resolve denuclearization, then you can improve relations, then you can provide economic benefits rather than the reverse order. And also, even just when they say both sides will fulfill their obligations, well, only one Korea has nukes, so that's the side that has to live up to it. So I think kind of applying the same method of analysis to the upcoming Singapore summit. As Anthony said, there's going to be a lot of, I think, automatic criticism afterwards. I think there's also going to be a lot of automatic praise after. Whatever comes out is the best because Trump is stronger than the weak Obama, and Trump wouldn't sign a flawed document like the Iran one. So I think there's going to be a lot of just very loud, very automatic praise and criticism. And I think the best place for us is kind of a middle lane in the road of, scoring the summit document by assessing its merits or lack thereof. And, I think given the administration's criticism of not only the JCPOA, but also all previous Korean agreements, that, this one has to be judged against the JCPOA, the 8 previous North Korean agreements, the 11 resolutions by the UN, as well as verification equal to or greater than what we had with CFE and START, et cetera. So it's a high bar the administration has set for itself, even if now it's trying to lower expectations.
Since we've admitted that this is a group of North Korea experts and not Trump experts, unfortunately, maybe I'm at the wrong panel, Maybe we talk a little bit about Kim Jong Un. One of the things that, and I'm going to start with Dr. Pak, because we've discussed this before. North Korea experts tend to say the North Koreans do this, the North Koreans do that. To what extent are they the same North Koreans, or do you see real differences with Kim Jong Un? I mean, he certainly has done, a couple of bolder things with marketization and the economy. He seems maybe a more enterprising character than his father. But is it the same old North Koreans?
There are differences between how Kim Jong Un handles things versus his father and grandfather. I think he's probably more like his grandfather in the gregarious way, the more transparent way that he deals with his public and with certain things. For example, in 2012, when the first satellite launch failed, the regime for the first time said it failed, but we're going to keep carrying on. So we thought that was a very significant moment, that he wanted to be a transparent sort of person. And also the fact that he spoke in public for the first time while his father shunned public speaking for almost 20 years, that he was the leader of North Korea. But I think I think that goes to the question of whether Kim is sincere, as everybody's been, that a lot of people have been saying about giving up his nuclear weapons. I think it's hard to. So while the brand, he's creating his own brand, but I don't think it's a different kind of product. So I think the North Korean. North Korea is Kim Jong Un, and Kim Jong Un is North Korea. He's identified himself with the nuclear weapons program, with this particular brand of North Korea that's modern, that's young, that's on the move. So I think that nuclear weapons are part of North Korea's identity, and also Kim Jong Un's identity. So that's why I think it's so difficult to think that he's going to give up all of this up after having completed what his grandfather started, to say, I'm going to start, getting rid of the nuclear weapons.
Do you think he could give it up? Would he have? I think I've asked you this before. Would he have the support of the military if he decides to, just basically capitulate? Say, we're going to try something really bold and different, give up our weapons, and go for economic integration. Would the military stand behind him?
There've been, after the so-called purge, the recent purge of the three hardline, military people with moderate military people. So I think we have to be careful about characterizing any North Korean official as hardline or moderate. Those are our terms that we post onto them. And that they'll be moderate when they want Kim, when Kim wants them to be moderate, and they'll be hardline when Kim wants to be hardline. I'll mention that Kim Young-chol, who was the person who met with President Trump last week, when he became the UFD director, or the United Front director, everyone thought, oh, he's a hardliner and he's going to be dealing with inter-Korean relations. That means hardline on inter-Korean relations. But he wore a suit to the White House, meaning that he was much more moderate, right, in terms of making sure that the summit went well and that the relationship with President Trump went well. So for Kim, I think if he were to give up nuclear weapons, at the agency we talk about signposts. This is, Kim is unlikely to give up his nuclear weapons, but if he were to make that strategic decision, these are the things that we would expect to see. I don't see those signposts yet, and that would be dismantling the ideological infrastructure that reveres nuclear weapons. It's in their textbooks, it's in what they learn at school, it's in their monuments, it's on their stamps. So I think if it's part of their cultural, political, mental iconography and their mental landscape. So once that we see signs that that's eroding, then maybe I'll start to believe that that's what that they've made this strategic decision. If they've loosened up on human rights violations, that would be a sign for me that that Kim is serious about joining the so-called family of nations. So those are big things that I would hope to see, that I would like to see, if to note that he might be moving in a different direction.
Yeah, I just add that, shifting from a hardliner to a moderate. I mean, it's sort of like going from Sonny Corleone to Michael Corleone. He dresses better, he acts nicer. He's still in the family. And you think of if Kim is picking moderates now, Kim's not real high on the moderate scale. I mean, he's a guy who killed his brother using nerve gas in a crowded civilian airport, and et cetera. So, I remember in 1994 when some, including in the U.S. government, were saying Kim Jong-il was a bold economic reformer and North Korea was on the cusp of implementing massive economic reform, and sort of, we're still waiting. And then when Kim Jong Un came into power, it was he's was educated in Switzerland and et cetera. And the first 6 years we had self-imposed isolation, this race to cross the nuclear and missile finish line, purges, more than we could keep track of, et cetera. So, I'm also not seeing the signposts. We always have to keep our eyes open and always challenge our own analyses to see if things are different, or if there's new data, you do have to update your analysis. But I think right now what Kim Jong Un has been doing is implementing the second page of his father's 2-page playbook. It was always, provocations, threats, attacks, alternating with charm offensives. So the first 6 years, Kim Jong Un only did the first half on steroids, given the pace of the testing. And now that he shifted to page 2, he's also done that one on steroids with this revolving door of summits from a guy who hadn't even left his country until early this year.
This is actually, I think, more for Anthony, but I'm going to say a bit about what I think, because I think behind here there is, something about the decline of the U.S. in Asia, and I think we are a declining power in Northeast Asia, and whichever way this goes, if there's a deal, it might mean a reduction of U.S. troops. If there's not a deal, do we become more irrelevant? And the question for Anthony is, how much pressure, how important is the U.S. really to North Korea? We've discussed this before. They seem to be circumventing sanctions, and I don't mean cheating, but they've done their own marketization. They have, investment from China, department stores, the Roscom people, Egyptian, did their telecom until they were cut out. Can they modernize and open up completely without the U.S.? Or is the U.S. financial system and the U.S. sanctions so important to them?
Well, in the absence of some kind of deal, if you have a Trump administration that's still either talking about maximum pressure or putting some kind of sanctions pressure on North Korea, I think that would be difficult for them to do on their own. I think at one point people look at the North Korean economy and point to certain things and say, these prices are stable, or the conversion with the won are stable, or things of that sort. And I would just remind people that we only got to the broader commodities sanctions toward the end of this maximum pressure campaign, right? Before, we were very focused on going after things related to the weapons program and going after things related to the revenue related to the weapons programs. We got to the broader set of sanctions, and then Kim has, and so my view has always been on maximum pressure is that not that the pressure as it was in January was hurting Kim, and it was that he saw 6, 8, 12 months down the road where China was implementing sanctions, and that would hurt him more. I think the whole discussion about moderates over the weekend reminds us about Kim Jong Un was supposed to be the Swiss educated reformer, right? I think there's this tendency to try and shoehorn that in, and there's also this debate on Iran too between moderates and hardliners, and I think Jung put it right. I think that's always been our model and not their model. And I think when you look at signposts too, you look at what they did to the nuclear test site. It didn't take long for us to, it took longer, it took a shorter period of time than before. I think people, when the cooling tower, and I think it was 2008, was destroyed, everybody, celebrations and balloons and all that, this is a significant sign of their denuclearization, and of course it was not. You only have to look at Google Maps now, and there's a nuclear reactor on the site of that cooling tower to tell you how really worthless that process was. And now we're seeing with the test site itself that experts and folks in the intelligence community are saying that it was all just a big ruse to get us to believe that they've done something. So right now they need to do something to show their commitment to denuclearization. It's not clear that they're ready to do that.
Okay. I think we're going to open up for questions. Do we have a house mic? And please introduce yourself and try to keep the questions short.
Hi, I'm Deborah Saunders with the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I'm curious to know if anyone here has an opinion about the White House having Kim Jong-chol into the Oval Office and President Trump shaking his hand on Friday.
I just make sure we sweep the room for bugs afterwards. A lot of people say, well, he shouldn't have met. It's giving a victory to North Korea. I mean, I can kind of see both sides of that. But, I just contrast it with, he had the sort of the beaming smile and the grip and grin photo when in 2000, I think when Bill Clinton went to get the two journalists out, he told his delegation, this is a serious issue, no smiling. So there was a very kind of grim visage of, we are here for a serious mission. This is not a breakthrough. So, I think, it's fine to meet with senior officials. I mean, that's why also we have diplomats. But it is, I think you do have to think of the ramifications. I mean, here he's shaking hands with a guy responsible for at least 46 deaths in South Korea, the sinking of the Jongun, reportedly behind the largest cyber attack on U.S. soil, the Soniac. So that image leads to, I think, a weakening of international enforcement of sanctions, where people will say, look, if both President Moon and President Trump, meet with people like this, why should we be more Korean than the South Koreans? Why should we enforce sanctions if both the U.S. and South Korea are getting special dispensation to allow these people to evade sanctions for travel? So, the meeting itself, I think, is fine, but you do have to think of second and third order ramifications.
But you could also learn about who he is, how he interacts with Americans, try to assess how much of a role he has in the whole process, his access to Kim Jong Un. So you could, there are small opportunities there, but but he, being a seasoned intel person, he's going to know what to say and what not to say, and what to, and how to shape the situation.
I mean, I would just say quickly, if you're not going to meet, if your standard is you can't meet with this despicable person in North Korea, you're never going to be able to meet with a North Korean, right? I mean, just let's be clear. And I would say that at least people associated with the government, I would say. And I would also say that the comments on the driveway of the White House were far more damaging than any photo with a smile or the envelope. I mean, saying that you don't even want to say maximum pressure, suggesting perhaps that, you're now interested in phased denuclearization, those things were far more damaging to the president's own policy than standing there with a big envelope and smiling, in my view.
Thank you. Chris Bidwell from the Federation of American Scientists. Thank you all for some great comments and presentation, insightful knowledge. My question is this. I read a snippet today about the arrest of 3 senior military officials, maybe more than an arrest, just recently. How secure is Kim Jong-il in going away from his country? Is there going to be a problem of some type of coup going on while he's gone? Is that a real threat? Is that something to be considered, or is that a non-event? Thank you.
I mean, I guess there's a non-zero chance that there could be coup threats, but North Korea is North Korea because it and the Kim dynasty has been able to sustain itself because of its overlapping security systems, where everyone from the local neighborhood to the national level are informing on each other. So I would say that I wouldn't discount it completely, but I would also think that I'd be cautious about saying that the recent the leadership shuffle is a sign of Kim's weakness, but I think it's more that it's a sign that he feels comfortable with shifting people around, especially at this particular moment. And I always mention the fact that when you do lop off some senior officials and lop off some senior officials, there are lots of other people who really want to rise up. So you create a whole different cohorts of loyalists who are people who are loyal to you and you only, and rather than those particular leaders. So you prevent the organizations from getting ossified or loyalties being solidified. So to keep moving people around to make sure to keep that from happening.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, I mean, I'm sure Kim is concerned about it. I mean, he's probably thinking, if he gets to Singapore, it's like, hey, my password doesn't work on my phone anymore. I wonder what's up back home. But yeah, I think, we had sort of similar questions whenever there was a purge. And, one half would see it as, it's a, shaky, weak leader, unstable regime. Or I tended to lean more on the, this shows how stable it is, that he's firmly in control, that he is confident enough to go after even the senior leadership. So, although they could always rise up against him either, as a coup or someone giving him a 9mm headache, so far it hasn't happened, nor did it happen under his father, because there's these, competing security services that report not only on the citizens and the officials, but on each other. So, I think that he's pretty firmly in control.
In the back.
Hi, Alex Ward from Vox here. Quick question based on something that Anthony had mentioned and extrapolating a little bit. If the summit doesn't go well, or is at least perceived not to go well by either of the leaders, does the chance of war between the two countries rise, however slightly?
I think if Kim decides to use his military forces against South Korea, which he has done in the past, the recent past, perhaps there'll be a military response. I mean, that's part of the reason why I wrote the research memo, because I think people had this impression. Sorry, I can't see you behind the pillar, but people have this impression that there's nothing more there for maximum pressure. I mean, my view has been, you have to be poised to respond to North Korea's military activities. I think there's some elements in the paper I wrote that we could do more on that front, but there's more there on maximum pressure. And you try this method. I mean, I disagree with the people who suggest we're trying. This is our shot at diplomacy, and then that's it. We're going to do war or whatever. This is just one part of the process. As I mentioned earlier, I think Kim believes that maximum pressure would have been a lot worse this fall, maybe even into next year. So if you're the administration, and I've told them directly, just go, that's part of the reason why you just walk out. If Kim is playing the same games or wants to renegotiate the joint statement, just walk out and say, okay, we're going back to max pressure. And that's a concern for the Chinese, I think, too, because they're the ones, I mean, this is why it's a gamble for the Chinese leadership, is that they're trying to push Kim toward Trump, and if it blows up in their faces, it's their banks that are going to suffer, because that's really going to be I think the first part of the next maximum pressure campaign.
I think one of the things that's been so striking in this sort of series of whiplash, events we've had this year is the shift from seemingly the brink of war to the brink of peace, which then makes some people say, we were never going to do a preventive attack. But, I think all of the Korea watchers in town and elsewhere were almost on a daily basis calling each other to test, where we were on our nervousness level, because we are all not only reading the public statements from, say, H.R. McMaster, who said, the president has asked us to look into preventive attack options, but we all talk to people in the government, and other foreign government people talk to us and things. There was a great concern, because it was, I think the best depiction was that, the administration was seriously considering preventive attack as an option. Now you can either focus on the first half and seriously consider and be very nervous, or you can say as an option and not be very concerned. But I think it was a very real option. Given North Korea's actions, and I think perhaps the threats of a preventive attack had a bigger impact on the South Korean leader than the North Korean leader. And I think that really induced Moon to go very strongly on trying to reach out to North Korea with little conditionality in order to reduce the potential for an attack. And so now we've kind of gone, I think, so far down the diplomatic path. And I think both Kim and Trump want a success. So I think they're not eager to say, well, that was a failure, let's start the bombing. So I think we've definitely stepped back from what had been a potential option. And I think even if the summit is a failure, it's now going to be harder to ramp up maximum pressure because China and South Korea are going to be eager to not do that. And so I think, I'm afraid we've seen the high water mark of maximum pressure.
Well, I mean, it'll be harder, but the framework is there for that. I mean, I wouldn't say high watermark. The question I have is, what makes it different for this administration to decide to go after Chinese banks when they weren't willing to do it before?
True.
And again, I keep mentioning Iran. That's why these are all interlinked, because if the U.S. is not willing to go after Chinese banks for what, in my view, is blatant violations of U.S. law, what convinces us that this administration is going to go after European banks and others that might be doing that for Iran sanctions violations? And so I think these are all interlinked. And so from my perspective, we can do a scorecard, but I would say if we're going back to max pressure and the first thing out of there is not going after Chinese networks or Chinese banks, that could wind up harming the administration's policy both on Iran and North Korea.
Something that I find very interesting here, listening to you speak, is there seems to be like kind of a reversal of political roles among the North Korea analysts. I know the traditional Democrats, liberals, even the lefties, are very enthusiastic about Trump, at least when it comes to this Korea summit. Most of the conservatives I know are very skeptical. Do you feel like you've kind of reversed roles? I think, Bruce, I just heard you kind of praising Bill Clinton.
Well, for being grumpy. I'm comfortable with grumpy. No, I try to see things, given 20 years of training in the intelligence community where you are fiercely apolitical, fiercely non-ideological. I try to look at that, apply that analysis now. So, in the 11 years I've been at Heritage, I've been supportive and critical of George Bush and of Obama and of Trump, depending on the situation, rather than their political party. So if someone's doing something which I think is not in the interest of the U.S., I'll criticize them, and I don't really care whether they have a D or an R after their name. With this summit, I'm more comfortable with the bottom-up approach that the U.S. has done before, and admittedly, all of those diplomatic efforts failed. But I remember attending White House meetings in 2000 when Clinton was still president, and North Korea had invited Bill to go to North Korea. And some in the administration were saying that, yes, he should go. The force of Bill's personality is so strong we can get everything we want if we just get him in the same room as Kim Jong Un. The majority view, though, was we don't deploy a president to negotiate a treaty. We deploy a president to sign a treaty where we know where every piece of punctuation is on that piece of paper. And there were meetings between U.S. and North Korean officials on a possible missile deal, which didn't go well. North Korea would not move forward. And so the U.S., I think, wisely decided, well, then we're not going to send the president. So here, obviously, we're doing it totally different. So it's something that really none of us are familiar with, and I think we're not comfortable with. And given what I think is a lack of clarity on what North Korea policy is, and that it does seem to shift a lot, I'm not comfortable with the U.S. going in position because I'm not really sure what it is.
Yeah. Question over here.
And there's another one in the back corner behind the post. Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kim from Radio Free Asia,
Uh-huh.
and there was a report that North Korea has replaced the top 3 military officers recently, or last month or something. And do you think it could be signal of maybe Kim Jong Un wants to restructure of his military ahead of this summit, or maybe ultimately the strategy change or policy changes? What do you think the implication of this restructure?
Right. Well, we kind of addressed that one, but I would just add that, oftentimes when there's a personnel change, people read a lot into it. And, some will see it as, oh, if he just replaced them over the weekend, it must be because the military or the other hardliners were resisting his opening of North Korea and his implementation of North Korea Sunshine Policy. But I think at least one of the officials was replaced a month ago, and so I think we have to hold back on reading too much into the motivations or the objectives behind replacing them. If we want to put it into the context of he's replacing them because they're resisting opening up, well then how do we explain all of the other very numerous purges of officials in the past? So I think it's very interesting, it bears watching, but I'm not ready yet to say why I think he did it.
I'd also say that, with these personnel shuffles too, it's not always about us. It's just internal. He just decided to do it at that particular day or month or whatever. So I think, so in addition to all the other, speculative comments, in the Twitterverse and on TV, I would also just remind people that it's not always externally focused.
It may just be those 3 poor guys happen to fall asleep in a meeting,
Or they got too old, and he was going to
Yeah.
replace them with younger
Yeah.
people anyway. So that was a long-standing thing. So I would just be cautious about that.
There's one in the far back there.
I can't see all of
Yeah,
it. Far
he's
back.
got a
Okay.
microphone.
Column, all right.
Hello, my name is Koji Sonoda from the Asahi newspaper, Japanese media, and thank you very much for a great presentation. And my question is the impact of the end to the Korean War. And actually, President Trump said Friday the end to the Korean War would be on the table at the summit. So my question is, if they declare the end of the Korean War at the summit, what do you make of the impact of the U.S. troops in South Korea and Japan in the long run?
There's both a legal and what I might say societal impact of either a signing of the peace treaty or even a political declaration ending the war, which is what Moon Jae-in is pushing for. A peace treaty, whether it's 3 or 4, however many people signing it, a peace treaty which would then have to be approved by the UN would remove or would cease the United Nations command, but it would have no impact on Combined Forces Command or U.S. Forces Korea or the level of U.S. forces on the peninsula, because those are a result of the bilateral defense treaty between Washington and Seoul and not the armistice or the UN legislation or whatever which created UN command. And in my view, a peace treaty should only be signed after we reduce not only the nuclear threat, but the conventional force threat to South Korea, as well as to Japan. So what I've advocated is what we should have is what would be long, arduous negotiations similar to the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty negotiations, and I was a member of that delegation for some time, that you thin out the forces away from the DMZ, you reduce the potential for a sudden start invasion, you reduce the threat of attack to the south as well as to Japan. You don't just sign a peace treaty, because then what that will do is the societal impact, whether it's the signing the treaty or a peace declaration is sort of this sense in South Korea, and I think in the U.S. To some degree, including in Congress, of, oh, the war's over, took us a little longer than we thought. Why are there forces there? Even if they're legally allowed to stay, why are they there? Let's bring them home to save money. You actually wouldn't save money. Or we can use those forces in other world hotspots. So it, I think, sort of sets in place some dominoes, even if it doesn't legally impact the level of U.S. forces.
But wouldn't it be a great propaganda coup for President Trump to say, I mean, he already is saying it, you know, I'll end this war that's been going on longer than any war in the history of mankind, which of course is not true.
Right, and I also think that it would embolden, it would give the Moon administration a lot of leeway to fast forward on the new economic map policies that they want to implement, and to better engage North Korea. And I want to go back to Alex's question about, you know, what if this summit fails? I think it depends on how you define failure. And how you define success. So if there is some sort of end of the Korean War at the summit, who is that a win for, right? And I think it depends on who you ask. If that's a win for the Moon administration, yes, because that's what they've wanted. Is that a win for us in terms of U.S. credibility, standing, and other things in the region? Maybe not. Is that a win for people who want U.S. troops completely off the peninsula? Yes, because that only strengthens their argument about that it's not necessary. So I think, as with many things on this issue, what you said, Barbara, about political realignments and who's supporting and who's not supporting. This issue, I think there's so much of a scramble, as Bruce mentioned, about what is failure, what is success, who's with whom, who supports what. So I think it's less clear than probably it was maybe 2 or 5 years ago.
I think we have time for these 2 questions, and I think that's going to be it. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Helga Barth. I'm with the German Embassy. Thank you very much for your great presentations and questions to our answers to our questions. I'm very curious about your take whether the U.S.'s withdrawal from the GCPOA has actually strengthened or weakened the U.S. position in this whole scramble. Because, I mean, it hasn't gone unnoticed in Pyongyang that there's another country and there was another agreement. There was no summitry in Singapore, but there was an agreement that the U.S. was somehow part of. So I'd be very curious about your opinion.
I think the kind of the initial narrative would be, especially before the U.S. pulled out, would be, well, if the U.S. pulls out, then that'll sort of collapse any U.S. North Korea discussions. And that, you would think North Korea would say, look, if you pull out of an agreement, why should we sign anything with you? And I remember talking to North Koreans last year when they said, your policy changes every 4 or 8 years. How could we ever trust you again in some future negotiation? And I said, yeah, democracy's pretty messy. You ought to try it sometime. That didn't go over well. But then again, the U.S. pulling out of it wasn't an unknown risk. And then even once the U.S. pulled out, North Korea is continuing this summit process. So I think it was a factor that they had already taken into account, and they're still interested in talking. So it doesn't seem to have had a direct impact on the North, at least their willingness to go down the path to a summit.
So I think it's more of a data point rather than, oh, this is it, we can't trust the U.S. So I think for the North Koreans, as Bruce mentioned, distrust of the U.S. has been there, and I think this is just another tick.
Right, and I think we should remember the North Koreans violated many deals with the United States. I would also say that it's the North Korea model that Iran has used. Don't allow inspections of military sites. Keep it to a flawed only nuclear deal. There are many others that Iran learned from North Korea on, and not the reverse. I would also say that if the administration uses their leverage the right way with withdrawing from the JCPOA, they could tell North Korea, look, we withdrew from a flawed nuclear-only deal, and that's not the deal we're interested in striking with you. The question that remains is whether they can use that leverage in Singapore the right way.
Okay, this will be the last question. Sorry, that's you.
Hi, my name is Shota Sato from Tokyo Broadcasting. Thank you very much for this great presentation. My question is the timing of this summit. Do you think it was ideal for the United States to take the summit now, as Donald Trump instantly agreed to have the meeting? He called it off, and then he puts it back on without even going through the huge envelope that we were talking about. And do you think this decision, the domestic political situation that he's facing now, namely the Russiagate and the midterm, do you think that kind of impacted his decision to have this summit this June? Thank you.
Another question for the Trump watchers, but you're all in Washington. You can take a stab at it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see the correlation other than timing. I think you saw the three different efforts: one in Singapore on logistics, one on the North Korean side of the border, right, on lower mid-level substance discussion, senior level, however you want to describe that, and then the New York/Washington meetings. The summit was already set up. I think, I'm not sure it's related to any domestic troubles you might be having.
I disagree. I mean, I think it's an obvious wag the dog. I mean, and I think this is, sorry, I know I'm supposed to be the moderator, but this is, I think part of President Trump's political instinct, maybe his political brilliance of, creating a very large distraction. And it's, certainly better than the wag the dog scenario, which is starting a war.
Right, but I know there was a lot of criticism of the president taking this summit like almost immediately, and we can talk through whether that was true or there are reports coming out maybe that wasn't true, that we knew that some of this was going to come. But the bottom line is, at the time he agreed to the summit, the North Koreans allegedly were okay with U.S. South Korean military exercises continuing, which we now know is not true, and then had made this decision to denuclearize, which I would argue we now know is also not true. So from a max pressure, whether it's at a high water mark or whatever you want to say, if you're the president of the United States, how do you say no when the Chinese are going to say, okay, you said no to the two things that you wanted, or at least one of the major things you've wanted? Your max pressure would have disappeared immediately. So, I mean, I'm not going to get into the politics of whether, this is a wag the dog, but I mean, the fact is that the North Koreans, at least on the surface, were ready to talk. Now, whether we should continue with that summit is, I think, a different question.
Yeah, I would say I don't think there's a correlation. I think there's enough momentum, kind of on the Korean Peninsula leading up to, Trump's acquiescence to having a summit. But really the answer is we don't know, just as we really don't know what's going to happen in the summit. And the analogy I've been using is, it's going to be like when the Cardinals go into the Sistine Chapel to choose a new pope. The two leaders are going to go in, they're going to close the door, and the world's going to be waiting with hope and trepidation whether white smoke or black smoke comes out of the chimney, meaning we have success or failure. But and finally, in a shameless self-promotion, if we didn't get to everyone's questions today, tomorrow I'm hosting an event at Heritage Foundation starting at 1:30. I've got three panelists talking about the U.S. North Korea summit, followed by three more panelists where we're talking about kind of Japan's neglected role and how they seem to be out in the cold on this whole issue. So join us at Heritage tomorrow.
Yeah, go ahead.
Last comment. So I think it's different. It's different from, I agree that maybe because President Trump agreed so quickly to meeting with the North Koreans that at the time maybe it was just not related to any political issues. But I think it probably evolved over time. And that he wanted it more and more as the time went on. And shame on the political advisor who advises him, hey, this would be a great thing for your, for the midterm elections and for your standing as an international statesman, because that would be that's what political advisors are supposed to be advising. So, I think it would be, one could imagine that there would be domestic political considerations in this type of decision.
Okay. I think that's it. That's a wrap.
We solved it all. That's good. Okay.